Okay, so now that we've learned the basics of how to set up our shots, we're going to learn the different settings that can affect the camera exposure or the exposure of the scene in general. We're going to be diving into the exposure tab of the post-process volume. And if needed, we're going to go into each individual camera to tweak its own exposure settings as well. So we've already kind of set our camera's exposures throughout the modules. We just haven't seen why or how we've done that. And that's what we're going to be doing in this module. So go ahead and load up module 7, and then the drop down in cinematics for the module 7 sequence. That'll put our actors in place. And before we start, I just wanted to show you a couple quick tips that I'd like to impart on you. The first one is, if we look at our world outliner, things can get pretty messy if at some point we kind of drop down all these things, right? And kind of cumbersome and hard to look at, and scrolling down, scrolling up can be kind of a nuisance. So a really quick tip is click Shift, press and hold, and then come up here to the root folder on the drop down arrow and click it by holding Shift, and then release Shift, and now drop down again, and you'll see everything's been collapsed into their respective folders. Just a really neat tip that can just keep things organized as you go forward. The next thing I wanted to bring up to your attention is the way we've kind of set our focus actors. And with the bone that we created earlier, the tray head bone, you'll notice that when you load up the map, the focus actor has been detached, and it's down here at the bottom. Not to worry, it's a really simple fix. If we click on our close-up tray, you'll see that it's out of focus. And the reason is, even though we have our camera set up, close-up tray, and we have our tracking set up to the focus tray actor, it's not in focus. And that's because the empty actor is somewhere elsewhere in the scene. Really quick fix is, we're going to go ahead and click and drag it. We're going to attach it to our head bone like we've done before. And once we're there, we can go ahead and scroll up and reset our location for that. And once we do that, boom, we're back in focus. The focus actor is back where it needs to be, and we're good to go. So just something to keep in mind when and if this happens. You just have to quickly reset that, and you'll be up and running again. So just wanted to show you that, and we can now talk about exposure and the post-process volume. So you'll notice that the overall scene right now is exposed to how we would want it to be, and it's actually very close to the exposure of our camera. That's been done on purpose, and I'll show you why and how we did all that. So the thing that's controlling the exposure of the scene right now is something called the post-process volume, and we have it in here. I'm going to go ahead and delete it and show you how to create it from scratch. So I'm going to delete that, and you'll notice that the scene's going to get brighter. This is kind of the default setting, default exposure before we add our post-process volume. And the post-process volume is just an Unreal Engine component that allows you to kind of tweak the overall look and the feel of the scene by giving you different exposure, or like different parameters you can play with. So it could be exposure, it could be color grading, and bloom and grain and other artifacts like that as well too. We'll be looking at those in a future module. But for now, we're going to go over here to the Place Actors window. We're going to search for post-process volume, and we're going to click and drag that into the scene. And you'll see we don't really see anything. That's because we've hidden our objects. So we click G to bring those up, and you'll see we have this orange cube right here. And that's our volume. And in order to make sure that the entire scene exposure is being changed, so what I'll show you, I'll demo that for you right now. If we go to our exposure tab in the post-process volume, let's make sure we bring this into our folder, our volumes folder right here. And if we change our exposure to manual and make our exposure adjustment, you'll notice that nothing's changed. But once I get into that cube, now that's at the exposure we want it to be. The thing is, we don't need this for this scene. We want it to be, we don't want it to be localized like this. We want it to be applied to the entire scene. So let's go ahead and search for Unbound. And this button right here, Infinite Extent Unbound, this will make the volume, as it says right there, cover the whole world and not just inside of this cube. So that's what we're going to want to do. We're going to set that to Unbound. And all of a sudden you see it's applied to the entire world. Okay, great. So we're on our way. Right now, if we go back to our exposure tab, we'll see obviously that we're a little bit too dark. You can kind of use your mouse here to kind of just find what you like. I typically like to set my overall scene exposure, or the post-process volumes scene exposure, to something that matches what we're going to see on camera. So to demo that really quickly, I'm going to set it right here at 10 for now. And this is a pretty good, for viewport viewing, for floating around the scene and finding your shots. This is a good exposure. It doesn't have to be much darker than this or brighter. And then we're going to pop into our close-up tray. And we'll notice that our close-up tray is more properly exposed than our viewport exposure. And that's because we have different settings for the camera. You'll notice that these same settings that we have in the post-process volume, lens, all of these settings, bloom, all these things we're going to look at later, they also happen to be inside each one of the cameras. So if we scroll down and we see in the camera details panel, we'll see that the post-process also has the same settings for each camera. The only thing that I like to double up on, meaning something that I do in the world's post-process volume, but also the camera's post-process volume, or post-process details, I should say, is the exposure. And the reason why is you'll notice that when I pop in and out of this camera, we have two different exposures. And that's fine. That's a totally fine workflow, but I like to keep things closer to what I see in camera. I'm going to quickly demo something really quick. So if we turn off these manual exposures that we've made to the camera and just unclick these, you'll see that we're now the camera is subject to the exposure of the world. And because it has its own settings, like the aperture is at a 1.8 and other things, then it's going to be a little bit brighter than what the world is. So in order to change that, you could do it this way. You could go to the main post-process volume exposure, and you could set it to, 5, 6, 7, play around with it until you like it. 6 looked pretty good. But here's why I don't do this. When we pop out, we're going to see that the world's exposure is just too dark for us to work with. So we're going to do two different exposures, one for the world and one for the camera. So let's go ahead and go back to what we had for the post-process volume exposure. Let's go back to our 8.5, which seems to be in a good place. You saw that things got brighter over here on the camera. That's okay. That's because we unticked its own exposures down here. So again, with the EXP selected, we're going to go back to what we had with the camera's further adjustments in exposure. We'll make sure we have the manual and then the exposure compensation to a 6. And again, this can be where you think it needs to be. I like it at a 6. And what you'll notice now is because we've done separate adjustments for the camera and for the world, we're going to have a very similar exposure for both. And that's how I like to work personally. I like to make sure that the world's exposure and the camera's exposure are in sync so that when you're popping in and out, it's not jarring and you're good to go. So that's what we've done. I just wanted to mention a couple other things within the post-process volume of the camera and the post-process effects, I should call it, because it's not really a volume. It's just that it has the same effects panel that you can do on the volume. The volume, we'll call it, is what we're using for the world, and the post-process effects is what we're using for the camera. But again, all we're doubling up on is exposure. So, but to give you one more thing to look at, we have in the camera's details panel, we can look for, actually, we're going to just scroll down until you see under post-process, there'll be a camera tab. There it is. And we have a couple other settings here that if we wanted to make it even more accurate to what we would be using in real life, we can do those settings here. So we have shutter speed and we have ISO. We click both of those on. We're not going to really mess with this because we've already kind of set our aperture up top. And we're going to set our shutter speed to 1/48th, which is a typical shutter speed for shooting at 24 frames per second, which is the cinematic frame rate. And then ISO, if you're shooting on Alexa, is typically going to be at 800 ISO, which is the base native ISO for that camera. And so we're going to set it to 800. You'll see that as we go up in ISO, we're going to go up in exposure on the camera. That's okay. We'll do that just to keep things as accurate to real life as possible for now. And we're going to want to make a further adjustment on the exposure of the camera. So again, let's look up for EXP. And over here, we're going to bring it back down, back to where we had it. So maybe something, we can just use this, we can just click and drag. Maybe something in this vicinity, right? Somewhere in that vicinity. It's close to a 3. I like to keep round numbers. Let's go 3. And there you have it. So that was just another little addition to the camera settings that affect exposure. So I just wanted to give you that as an option. You don't have to do that at all. You can keep it at default. But if you come from on-set experience and those things are familiar to you, that's how you set them. So the last thing I wanted to show you is in the post-process volume itself, there's a setting for motion blur. And this won't really affect us here because we don't have any camera movement. But I just wanted to show you, you can turn it on in the post-process volume as well. So if you search for motion, I'll bring up the motion blur tab, and we're going to just turn all of these on. Our target FPS is 24. That's the only thing we're going to change. FPS meaning frame rate, frames per second. And we're going to take a look. So you'll see that when I move the camera now, there is a little bit of motion blur, and it makes it look pretty cinematic. Because we set that in the post-process volume, you'll notice that even when we're out here in the viewport, there's motion blur there as well. It's just easier to set the motion blur to the post-process volume because it'll affect everything, all the cameras, including you moving around in the viewport. Now, you really don't have to do this. It's just one more thing to show you guys to bring up another level of realism to what you might be accustomed to on set. But the only time that's going to really affect it is when we're doing a camera move. So for now, that will affect your performance level. It might make things a little bit slower, so you can totally turn that off. And in fact, we're going to turn that off right now. But that's how you do it. So that's pretty much it. We've now gone through all the main technical settings that can be tweaked to achieve a cinematic result.